Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Petra Lietz, and it is my pleasure as the Editor-in-Chief of the Australian Journal of Education to host this webinar about AJE's latest special issue entitled 20 Years of PISA in Australia. What can we say? It is the very first time that we are doing something like this, and it is our great pleasure to do so. And I'm very grateful to the authors and our guest editor to have agreed to participate in this webinar, and for all of you to attend, because I think we had nearly 200 registrations. So that is wonderful, and we're looking forward to the exchange. Now, before we start, I would like to acknowledge, I know we are spread far and wide, but here in Adelaide, I wish to acknowledge the Kaurna Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathering here. And I've got a few colleagues who are involved in the webinar. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. I acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who continue to contribute to our work to improve Indigenous learning, education, and research. And actually, one of the contributions that we are going to talk about is actually talking about some of the differences in or some of the insights that PISA can deliver in terms of Indigenous performance. Now, it is my great pleasure that we've got 5 guests all together. The first one is Kylie Hillman, who is the editor of the special issue. And also, when she's not editing the special issue, she's actually my co-editor for the journal. So that's Kylie Hillman from ACR. Then we have Florence Gabriel from the University of South Australia. We have John Ainley from the Australian Council for Educational Research. We've got Claire Scoular from the Australian Council for Educational Research, and Emma Medina from the Ministry of Education in New Zealand. Now, thank you all for making time to talk about your insights. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge, though, that because of time constraints and managing a webinar, we could only invite one of the authors for each article. I'd like to acknowledge that all of your articles have been co-authored. And so you are just representing the co-authors on this. Also, we only are presenting 4 articles here. The total number of articles in the issue are 6. Actually, we have just in the chat box, there is a link to the page where, because ACR is publishing the journal in cooperation with SAGE. On the SAGE page, this link will take you to the whole special issue. And for the whole of month of November, you will be able to download all articles for free. So it's a really good value add, as they say these days, where, you know, feel free. You are not infringing any copyright if you forward this link to your colleagues and networks. Now, if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat function. Here Kashfi and Juliet are going to help me to direct your questions. If you could put in at whom of the authors or the editor the question is addressed, that will help them, and that'll help me to direct them later on. And finally, just to let everyone know that the webinar is going to be recorded, just for those people in Europe or the US, where we all know there are more important things going on right now. So, to enable those people to watch it later on. Okay, let's get started. My first questions are to you, Kylie, editor of the special issue. Okay, PISA has been, so the International Program for Student Achievement by the OECD has been around now for 20 years. It assesses mathematics, reading, and science literacy every 3 years. And while 2020 is not, thankfully, not a PISA assessment year with COVID and everything, we it still means we've done 20 years of PISA in Australia. Now, often when the results get released, there's a little bit of hype in the media. Usually we hear, oh God, Australia has gone down again in mathematics achievement or reading or whatever. And one might actually ask oneself, why do we keep participating if, first of all, it's only ever bad news? And secondly, if we keep hearing the same results, Kylie?
Well, I suppose that's $1 million question, isn't it? I think firstly we need to acknowledge that it's much more common to report poor results than it is for any positive outcomes in our international assessments, and we have had positive outcomes in other international assessments. I think we're also still not at the end of our journey with PISA. Even though it's been 20 years since we began reporting, we've only just now released the third major assessment of reading. So we still have 2 other areas in which we don't have the third time point, if you will, if you want to focus on each cycle when it's the major focus of assessment. So the upcoming assessments of mathematics in the 2022 cycle now and science in the 2025 cycle are going to provide us an even richer picture of student performance in these areas, because each time an area is a major focus of assessment, the assessment is updated and upgraded. So for 2018, there was an inclusion of digital reading as a major component of students' interaction with texts now. So we're going to see more information coming out of PISA in that respect, and a better picture of trends when we get to that third time point.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my second point would be that there's so much more to PISA than just the average, the student means that are reported each time. We know, for instance, that there are differences in the average performance of different groups of students. We see this at each time PISA results are published, and we're not seeing any grade improvements, no reductions in those differences or shrinking of gaps. And so these differences, these inequities are not just going to disappear just because we stop measuring or reporting them.
I can't hear anything. Okay, thank you very much for that, Kylie. Now the first article that we would like to talk about is actually Florence. So welcome, Florence. You have co-written your article with Sarah Buckley and Abhinava Bhattakur, and your article is actually looking at one of the performances in mathematics. So as we said, there often is, in Australia, the issue is about decline in mathematics. I guess your article in a way is looking at what sort of factors are related to mathematics achievement and how maybe educators can influence that performance. So yeah, tell us a little bit about your article, please, Florence.
Thank you. Yes, you're right. So more and more research shows that emotion, like maths anxiety, are a fundamental part of the learning process. Many studies have identified a negative relationship between maths anxiety and maths performance. But this relationship is very complex, and it depends on a range of emotional, motivational, cognitive, and cognitive factors. So maths anxiety when students experience maths anxiety, they tend to rush through questions, they lose focus, or they simply give up when it all seems too hard for them. It's that tendency to feel nervous or even fear mathematics. So in our study, we looked at self-regulatory processes involved in mathematical learning, and we investigated the relationships between maths anxiety, motivation, cognitive strategies, and mathematical literacy. To do this, we used data from the 2012 cycle of PISA. So that was the last time maths was the main focus. And we looked at the responses of more than 4,000 Australian 15-year-old students. Our results confirmed that students with higher levels of maths anxiety have lower levels of mathematical literacy. We also found that higher levels of maths anxiety are associated with lower levels of instrumental motivation. So that's the degree to which students believe maths is important, with lower levels of self-concept. That's the students' belief in their own mathematical abilities, lower levels of perseverance, that willingness to work on difficult problems, and lower levels of self-efficacy. So that's the students' belief in their own ability to solve a specific maths problem. But more importantly, we showed a domino effect of these variables upon one another. And we used structural equation modeling to show that low instrumental motivation and self-concept lead to higher levels of maths anxiety, which affects perseverance, and that in turn affects self-efficacy, and all of that has a negative impact on mathematical literacy. So it's really a vicious circle.
So in terms of, obviously you just mentioned structural equation modeling. So that is something that you can do in a secondary data analysis like this. What makes for a strong analysis there? So
Structural equation modeling is a statistical technique that is widely used in educational psychology and more broadly in behavioral sciences. It can be viewed as a combination of factor analysis and regression analysis. And it's often used to assess unobservable latent constructs. So it's particularly useful here. So latent variables are defined using one or more observed variables. And then a structural model that relies heavily on theory imputes relationships between latent variables. To provide a simple example, the concept of maths anxiety, it cannot be measured directly as you would measure height or weight, for example. But researchers, psychologists, they develop hypotheses and theories about what maths anxiety is, and they develop measurement instruments to measure maths anxiety. So here, maths anxiety would be the latent variable, and the items used in PISA would be the observed variables. So based on that, you build a model, use the CFA, measurement model, confirmatory factor analysis, to estimate the latent variables and the goodness of fit of the model. And then a structural model to identify the direction of the relationships between all these latent variables. So it's particularly useful for data sets like that.
And it really is a rather confirmatory approach where you come in with some theoretical model and can explore how these constructs work together. Now, I think some teachers might be listening from your results. What do you think? Because also obviously PISA has an emphasis on literacy, and that doesn't mean reading literacy, but it's this concept of applying what students have learned in school to real life problems. So, you know, if teachers are looking at improving their practice, is there anything that you can tell them, or if parents want to help the children, is there anything in what you found that could be applied there?
Yes, so to break the vicious circle that I mentioned before, our research really supports the idea that we need to build and grow students' confidence in mathematics. So teachers could, for example, highlight what students are already able to do before attempting new challenges. They could emphasize to students what they should focus on, so like past successes more so than failures. Make sure that we grow that confidence. And they can also help students appreciate the control they have over their own achievement in mathematics. So
practicing.
Yeah, and really building that confidence in students in their own abilities, and counteracting negative emotions around maths. I think that's really key. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks. And we might get some questions. Thank you already for putting in a few questions there in the chat. I'd like to get through our authors first, and then we'll get to the questions at the end, and already apologies if we don't get to everyone, but we'll try our best. So next one of the rank, John. Now you have been involved in international assessments like PISA for eons. So when we talked a little bit about this before, and you were actually saying, oh, this special issue has given me the opportunity to explore a topic or a phenomenon that I had been wanting to explore for a while. Now, can you tell us a little bit about what triggered your interest, and then, of course, what you found with your co-authors, Dan Cloney and Jessica Thompson?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Petra. And I was going to say that when I use the term we in this discussion, I'm talking on behalf of Dan Cloney and Jessica Thompson, who did much of the work behind this paper. We together started thinking about possible explanations for the decline in PISA scores over the first 2 decades of this century, something that attracts a lot of commentary. And we had noticed that there'd been a shift in the distribution of the 15-year-old students across year levels over that period of time. Nationally, around 2000, there were about 18% of 15-year-olds were in year 11. By the time we got to 2018, there were just 7% there. Mm-hmm. In 2 states, there was a much greater shift than that. In Western Australia, the percentage of students who were in year 11 went from 50% at the turn of the century to 15% in 2018. And in Queensland, it went from 40% to 15%. So we were interested in to what extent this shift in the year level of the 15-year-old students might contribute to an explanation of the decline in PISA scores. We could look back at those shifts and see in Western Australia and Queensland a source of the change that was the introduction of a foundation year about a decade earlier. But that wasn't our focus. That just told us that what we were observing had a real foundation. And in fact, in other states, there were smaller and more steady changes. For example, in Victoria, through the first decade, a steady increase in the percentage of students who are in year 9 rather than year 10. And in South Australia, a steady decrease in the percentage of students who were in year 11, even though it wasn't associated with any policy. So we were interested in following those through. So we focused attention on Western Australia and Queensland in our discussion, but we really looked across all Australian states and territories. We use multiple regression methods to estimate the student level effects of grade or year level for each PISA cycle, allowing for the effects of student characteristics and jurisdictions. We concluded that students in year 11 scored higher than students in year 10, hardly a surprise, but we are controlling, they're all 15 years old when I say that. An average net effect between 2006 and 2018 of about 42 scale points at an individual level. That's similar to the effects of 1 standard deviation of socioeconomic background, which we normally consider a moderate. We found also a relatively greater decline for 15-year-olds in year 11 compared to year 10 over time. And that contributed to the overall decline in PISA scores. That was something we had not expected. In looking for the effects that might explain declines in PISA scores over time, perhaps we should be focusing attention on what's happened in year 11 rather than what's happening in year 10, where most of the students are located. We also concluded that changes in the grade distributions of students contributed to changes in the average PISA achievement scores to a moderate extent in Western Australia and Queensland, but to a much smaller extent to the overall decline in PISA achievement nationally. But it was there. And we also found that that correspondence over time was quite complex. There are other changes going on concurrently, and therefore we think that this needs to be looked at a bit more closely. So that was the thing. It grew out of this thing about what's going on that's causing the changes in PISA scores over 2 decades. Why are they declining? Does it relate to the nature of the school experience of the students who are in PISA? That is, whether they're in year 11 or year 10, or some of them in year 9.
Yeah, thanks, John. I guess that is one of the things, you know, how often PISA is criticized or sometimes criticized for comparing, you know, because we've got 70 or so economies participating. So there's always this criticism of what can Australia learn from Shanghai or something, which is why I was interested in your analysis, which really explores the changes within Australia over time and does that quite rigorously. Now, what would you say to the people that, I mean, ultimately what you're saying is that we have a 15-year-old sample, and because it's an age-based sample, they can be in different grades. Now, what would you say to the person? Say, oh, well, it's pretty clear that usually if children are already identified as being quite able, they start school earlier. So therefore, maybe regardless of the school experience, they would be doing well. And of course, they will be, by the time they are 15, they are a year ahead. They are already in grade 11. Is there anything in that?
Oh, I think in Western Australia and Queensland, we actually have a natural experiment. The system changed. In Western Australia, it changed quite sharply over a 2-year period to introduce the preparatory or the foundation year, and therefore have a consequential change in the average age of students there. It wasn't as if, so it was the thing. In Queensland, it was a same thing, but it was spread over more years to introduce that change to the introduction of the foundation.
So it's not as simple as that.
It's not as simple as that. Only in Victoria, the Victorian explanation is you see the small effect of people deciding to enrol their students at school later when they're a little older.
That's right. Okay, thanks very much, John. Now, next one is Claire. Claire, your article is so fascinating because we often think of PISA as doing reading, assessing reading, mathematics and science, and sort of rinse and repeat every 3 years. However, there's also always some innovation going on. And one of these innovations was, how do we go about measuring problem solving, and not just problem solving, but collaborative problem solving in such a diverse country and cultural conglomerate as the PISA family, if you so like. So, Claire, would you like, with your co-authors, Sophia Eftharianadu and Dara Ramalingan and Dan Clooney, you actually wrote about different frameworks for collaborative problem solving, and you also illustrated well how very modern, up-to-date psychometric analysis in terms of item response theory contribute to refining and validating those frameworks. So could you explain a little bit how all of that worked with your article? Thanks, Claire.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so there was a initial mapping that we conducted. A few of the frameworks are now, 5+ years old for understanding and defining collaboration or collaborative problem solving. And of course, as we've been analysing some assessment data, we were actually able to understand a lot more about this complex skill. And so part of the work we had been conducting prior at ACR is to develop a modern revised framework for defining collaboration that relates to teaching and assessing it in the classroom. And so what that describes is some of the behaviours that we can associate with collaboration, and of course, various levels of proficiency. And so the first part of our article was mapping the PISA assessment along with 2 other assessments of collaboration to that framework. What that gives us is an idea of how well the PISA assessment and the others actually covered the entirety of the construct. Of course, no assessment necessarily has to measure every single aspect of the skill, but we were pleasantly surprised to see that all three of the assessments that we looked at provided great coverage for as we've outlined the framework. So we did a bit of that backwards mapping. And then, as you say, the second part of our article was actually to look at the robustness of the assessments in regards to their psychometric properties, and then being able to use that to make some interpretations again about levels of proficiency and the types of behaviours that we would, as we are now, associating with students' proficiency in collaboration.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the IRT, the item response theory analysis that you and your co-authors did, could you tell us, because being the eternal methodologist, also just to showcase that, you know, these sorts of articles in a special issue like that do enable those sorts of more sophisticated analysis. Can you just take us, without getting too technical, but telling us so like what it is that exactly that methodology can do for people like you who are really interested in a particular content area?
Sure. I think one of the main difficulties at the moment with the skills such as collaboration is that we still have a lot to learn, and we know fairly little relative to reading and maths, etc. So what these assessments are able to do is to provide us with some information, as I say, about what those behaviours students are demonstrating are. And IRT in particular gives you an idea of how well the items in a particular test are working together. And the inference that we make is that, you know, if the items if you get good fit statistics, that means that the items are working well, and that the interpretation of that is that they are measuring the same construct if there's good fit for each of those items. And so what this is able to tell us in regards to collaboration, for all three of our assessments that we looked at, including the PISA assessment, there was good item fit for the majority of those items, which means that all three of these assessments seem to be measuring the same skill. So now we've conceptually mapped them onto our framework. That second part was about, are they seeming to measure the same skill of collaborative problem solving, and then being able to look at the details of specific items to see, well, what is the student demonstrating in this particular item that we can connect back to those sub-elements or aspects of our collaboration framework. The other really good thing about the IRT is that it provides a derived scale from each of those assessments using a right map, or an item person map as it's often called. What that does, it places all of the items and the students in sort of two vertical histograms and lines those up so that you're able to see the distribution of the items and the students in relation to one another. What we actually do with that is that we're able to look at, again, what items fall at that bottom sort of end of the scale. The proxy for it is frequency. So the items that are all at the bottom end of the scale there are deemed to be the easiest items because they're the ones that are most frequently responded to positively from students. And the opposite is true of the top. The items at the top tend to be the more difficult. So what we're able to do then is dig a bit deeper as to what those items are doing, again, what the behaviours are that students are demonstrating in those items, and say, well, these are fairly easy things for students to do. An example in the collaboration assessments, we looked at some of those easier items are basic communication. Basic questions posed to other students, etc. The items at the top end, we can see patterns where there's some complex negotiation skills going on. There's a lot more back to and fro. Students are responding to one another with outcomes. So they might start with different responses each. They have a conversation about their responses, and then one of the students goes back and they actually change their response on reflection of the conversation they've had with the students. So we're then starting to build a bigger picture, being able to map some of those more difficult with some of those easier items, and we start to build an idea of proficiency within collaboration. And so what we've done is then mapped a big piece of the work that went on behind this article was to look at the skill development levels that we have in our conceptual framework. We've identified 5 different levels of proficiency, and we began those as hypothesized levels. And through reviewing the data from these 3 assessments, we're able to validate those levels. And so we've mapped all of the data, particularly from the PISA assessment, where there's so much data, and that's the great thing about being able to access that information. You know, you're starting to build up a much more robust, valid picture of what we had initially hypothesized.
Right. And so overall, I mean, one of the challenges in these international studies is always to say, well, to what extent have we managed to make or to develop a test that is equivalent across all these different cultures. So in your analysis, and you don't have to say it all worked perfectly, but you know, what are some of the challenges, just to pinpoint it again, in terms of collaborative problem solving? So which, you know, you explained nicely to us about the distribution, and that you find, you know, which ones are more difficult and which ones are easier. Now, obviously, we're always after a good spread. Now, are there different areas of collaborative problem solving where you either had to abandon the international measurement of it, or where you are thinking, oh, well, next time we have to develop some more items in this particular area, or make it a little bit harder, or, you know, any comments on that?
Absolutely, and I think that's part of the benefit of being able to map the assessment data to a common framework. You can say what's going well at the moment in terms of measuring collaboration and what's missing. Of course, all 3 of these assessments that I'm talking about are online or computer-based. So there should be a caveat around that, in the sense that, you know, we're not ever going to get the full picture of collaboration when it's an online or computer mode delivery. With PISA, we have a particular challenge in that, of course, there's got to be ubiquity in how they're trying to measure this across many different countries with different technological capacities. And so they went with the option of having one student simulating collaboration with the computer. And so they were able to select response options and to simulate that conversation with the computer. So I think there's a lot of skepticism that you're able to actually tap into the full complexity of collaboration when it is a single student dealing with a computer. That's why we introduced the other 2 assessments as well, so that we can sort of do a cross analysis to see, you know, when it's the other assessments had 2 students and then 3 students who were collaborating. And so you were then able to tap into other aspects that you couldn't in PISA, for example, open-ended response, chat response patterns, and the other assessments also have process data. So the end of our article goes into some of the summaries of what we think is working well in terms of measuring collaboration at the moment with the assessments that we reviewed, and what really needs to be done next, because, you know, we are looking at developing measures of collaboration too, and we want to see, as you say, where the gaps are and what could be done better. So we need to corroborate a lot of this, these findings with face-to-face measures.
Thanks for that. I guess it's particularly interesting now with COVID and more having to be done online. I guess, you know, you're saying, well, it's only being done online. Well, this is where, you know, currently a lot of people have to problem solve. I know that's taking it down sort of a notch, but in terms of, you know, what do we want our 15-year-olds to be able to do? Well, definitely, if there is another pandemic, or, you know, if, you know, the challenges strike, then for them to be able to be equipped with collaborative problem solving online. fascinating because, in some analysis that we did earlier, there's also this difference in terms of valuing collaboration across cultures and that. So, but maybe we'll get to that because I don't want to, that we've got quite a few questions coming in, Claire, and I would like to get now to Emma. So thanks for that for the time being. Now, Emma, you and Megan Chamberlain, have actually explored or compared Australia and New Zealand data. You have gone the full length. You've gone all the way back to 2000. Someone was asking, the one quick question I saw was how many times reading has been assessed. So reading was assessed, that was the first one to be assessed, 2000. So it would have been 2000 and then 9 years later. So that would be 2009 and then 2000 and another 6 years later. No, yeah. 3 times. So I think with reading we have 3 times, and that's what Kylie was saying earlier, but we don't have 3 times in all the subject areas. And of course, with anyone who's ever done modeling of change over time, you like to have 3 time points, because with 2, you can always go down again, whereas with 3, there's some sort of trend. So that's what Kylie meant earlier. Okay, coming back to you, Emma. So you've actually studied on comparing reading literacy for Australian and New Zealand students, and you have focused on, and we often hear that in Australia, differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, but also between students who are more advantaged in terms of their socioeconomic status. So what did you find? And I think we should point out that in terms of comparisons, this would be one of the ones that would sort of pass the pub test, as they say here in Australia, in the sense that both Australia and New Zealand have similar backgrounds and stories and education system set up. So which, therefore the validity of making a comparison between those 2 countries, I think is greater than some other countries. So Emma, over to you. Explain a little bit, please, what you found.
Yes, thanks, Petra. And you're exactly right. There are many, many similarities along historical and policy lines, which we go into, but also as well in PISA outcomes. So both countries have had similar average reading scores in 2000 all the way through 2018. But what this has meant and what others have alluded to is we've had the same decline, about 25 PISA reading points. And I will say, though, there are signs that it'd be interesting to see if that trajectory changes for Australia. Someone mentioned there are positive international results for Australia, one of them being in the last PEARLS, which is the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, in which the 2016 cohort had improved since the previous cycle. So it'll be interesting to see if PISA shows that as well.
Mentioning that PEARLS is at the 4th grade level, no?
Correct, yes. So they would be PISA age in 2021, and we're in the field in 2022. So there, I would say the points of difference are, well, similarity and difference in terms of educational equity. So if we look at the gender reading gap, which favors girls in most countries, it used to be larger in New Zealand, but is now more similar to size in Australia, only because our New Zealand girls have had a bigger decline in reading than boys. And another area is a gap in reading scores between socioeconomically advantaged and disadvantaged students, again, which favors advantaged students, also has been historically larger in New Zealand, but this gap has been lowering to Australian levels. For similar reasons, our advantaged students in New Zealand have been declining faster than our disadvantaged students. So that's interesting to look at. And lastly, though, the gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students is one area where the gap is larger in Australia than in New Zealand. And so just looking at size of those inequities and the changes over time are really interesting if we ever want to solve them in our respective countries.
Yeah, I think I looked at that once actually for an ACR research conference, and I think it's about double here than what it is in New Zealand, but the gap remains there, like the development of the gap, there is not much shift in either country.
Correct, that area, it's been steady, yeah.
Which is where it would be so nice if one country did were able to reduce it, and you would think, oh, what are you doing? Of course, with all the that there are differences obviously between the First Nations people and that, but and of course the other comment with the gender differences, it's nice if the differences reduce. But wouldn't we all like to see that actually the lower performing would come up to the higher performing? So what do you think? What do you think? I mean, yes, the gender gap narrows, but it's not. But average achievement isn't going up. What do you think that is? Are getting girls less interested in the reading, or what?
Well, I mean, we did look at factors related to reading achievement. So that included school climate and student attitudes and beliefs towards reading. So in both countries, in comparison to the OECD, we have poor disciplinary climates, higher truancy, lower sense of belonging at school, and higher bullying rates. And actually in 2018, just 60% of students said that they read for enjoyment, which has a serious decline since 2000. So we kind of looked at all those variables, and when demographics are held equal, we found that those all have significant effects on reading scores. The strongest actually being with confidence and enjoyment of reading, which Florence spoke to in confidence in mathematics. And so I think we cannot understate the importance of confidence in our students. And so we did, we're trying to see, or a difference that came out too that we saw was that New Zealand students are less confident in reading than their Australian peers. And this is true at the middle primary school level, which Pearls shows. And so we were trying to dig into what might be behind that. And we also kind of highlight that there are some practices that do contribute to confidence. One of them being reading aloud. And that helps a reader develop fluency. And we saw that New Zealand primary school students have less opportunity to read aloud than Australian students, also evidenced by Pearls. We really try to use both data sets to triangulate this information. So confidence, I think, cannot be understated.
Yeah, and that is an interesting parallel to what Florence's article and analysis showed, and something I guess that both parents and friends and educators in general can relatively easily influence, in the sense, not obviously you don't want the children to be overly confident, but I think what Florence said earlier about emphasizing what they can do already is also contributing to increasing the confidence and saying, oh, here, this is what I can do. Of course, in maths, there are all these things that they can't do, or, they can't read the Shakespeare novel yet, and maybe never will, but, obviously to let students know what they can do rather than all the time. Teachers, I think, often focus, obviously, because they also have to get through a curriculum, so it's like, oh, these are all the things that we still have to learn, rather than every now and again stop and say, whether it's mathematics or in reading, what it is that the children can already do. So I think that's a good learning from both of your studies. Now, what just because you are slightly different, but positively so, because you are actually working in a department, in the ministry. So whereas ACR and Florence is at a university, so we come more from the research side of things. Now, in terms of these assessments like PISA, I guess were initially mainly directed not so much at the practitioners, but rather at the policymakers, to enable them to monitor achievement at the system level over time. Now, every 3 years, and you actually you're at the coalface, you have to convince schools and teachers that here we are again, 3 years. Now, do you think it's worth it? Do you think it's worth it?
I do ask myself of this. I do not take the time of our students or our principals for granted, the time that they invest in this research. And I would not be in the role, I think, of leading the PISA study in New Zealand if I did not. I think it is extremely important to keep our policymakers and systems accountable for their promises of equity and excellence. And that's what I think this study contributes to, as well as building a wealth of knowledge. As we see from the panelists today, the data sets provide such a great window into new insights. So, yeah.
Okay, and I guess I've never worked in an education department. So, when you see something and you see it again and again, do you ever feel like, oh, now I'm going to produce a brief for the minister and this is what we should be doing? Or, is there anything like that? Or you get a chance like that?
I think so. And and I think what the key and the art is to work alongside other experts and policy people to craft those recommendations. And I think that is a skill. It's not just presenting the bad news. It's saying, it's working alongside others, getting perspective on what could be done.
Because of course, New Zealand, like Australia, they are two countries who have been involved many more years than the 20 years that PISA has been conducted. No? So I think it's good to hear that people working in departments do think it's a worthwhile exercise, because of course also New Zealand and Australia are in a similar position because we don't have that many schools. So it's really, like you say, Emma, it's, do we use our that time wisely, because we have to go back to the same schools all the time. No? Yeah.
I will say one more thing about that. I think this is why I think it's worth it. With the results having come out a year ago for 2018, and reading being the focus, and our decline, or we have a long-term decline in New Zealand. I should say over the past couple cycles, it's been steady, but long-term decline. There has been real change happening within the ministry. We are enhancing a Ready to Read series, which is designed for explicit and systematic teaching of phonics. And our Chief Education Scientific Advisor released a report on the state of literacy, and really used a life course approach to identify, how to optimize learning at all ages rather than in isolated solutions. And so I think these sort of results kind of push people to continue the work of improving. Yep.
Okay, thanks for that, Emma. Now, and thank you to all authors and to Kylie for sharing, your insights so far. That leaves us a good 10 minutes, I think, for the questions and answers. The first one, or there are a couple actually, about reading literacy and the decline. Now there's explanation for the decline in Australia's reading results from 2000 to 2018. Has been analysis done of this data and suggestions made for the data's decline across those 18 years. Now, while the other authors are talking about it, I also work for ACR, and South Australia was actually one of the was one of the jurisdictions that had a significant decline between 2000 and 2009. So we actually did some analysis here, but of course this was only between 2000 and 2009, not to 2018. But it relates a little bit back to what John was saying earlier, in that the proportion of students, of high-performing students, actually declined quite a bit. So while that might not be a really great finding, because you think, what can we do about it? It's you know, that there is that learning maybe that we also need to, like many programs, focus on helping the weaker students or the students who struggle. But while there is some effort to extend the higher performing students, maybe that sometimes can do with a bit more attention. The other thing we found in there was that the interest in reading had declined considerably, significantly in South Australia, particularly for boys. And that was despite an initiative we had here at the time, which was called the Premier's Reading Challenge, which rewarded kids for reading lots and lots and lots up to secondary school level. So that's my initial reaction, but if the authors have got something to say here, feel free to chip in. Anyone? No? Emma or John? Or?
Oh, I think, Petra, it's one of the big challenges for PISA in Australia to explain why the PISA scores have declined over time, and we know that the equating process is fairly sound, so it's a decline now. The paper that Dan and Jessica and I did, we said part of this is the context, the learning context that the kids are in that there's a different learning context when you're in a year 11 class than when you're in a year 10 class, and that shift will contribute a little bit, but that's not the whole story. There's a lot more to be done about that. And I think what you alluded to, the shift in the distribution of abilities across the spectrum, is an important part of that too. Yep.
Yeah, and I will just add that I think while PISA has limitations in terms of explaining the real mechanisms behind it, we can also know that reading, literacy, and development it's a complex ecosystem of lots of variables, and so we shouldn't just think about one aspect. We can think about confidence and enjoyment and instructional practices and all that.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. There, we have a question here about who do we define as policymakers, and who best decides if PISA is helpful, because it's highly contentious. Now, of course, we know that PISA is highly contentious, and but I think we have also, what this is trying to illustrate is that more in-depth analysis are being able, and you know, some of these more horse race and league table results, or like Kylie said at the beginning, or you know, media is always more geared towards reporting negative results. So you know, this is about what can we learn from the data. So policymakers, I guess they ultimately, it's the ministries of education that make the decisions, and that should be informed by what is our good, robust data, isn't it? I think maybe John, you have a view on that.
Yes, sorry, Petra, I just muted my microphone. Yes, look, I think the policymakers operate at various levels, and but for PISA, the policymakers to whom those findings are directed at principally people who are responsible for the middle level and senior management of school systems to look at big picture questions across the system. But also there is, particularly in the work that Florence talked about, there's messages there for teachers who are practicing and things. I think one of the things that has made PISA contentious in a lot of countries is the extent to which it has embodied an approach to the assessment of learning, which is a little bit different to what we had previously. And so therefore, it carries messages for how you might adapt teaching to address those issues.
Yeah. That's true. To say, just we have a comment here on the Florence, on your article about the factors that influence maths achievement here. They are saying because it's been measured at the same time, can you really talk about direction of effect? Or is it strictly speaking an association, at one point in time? Would you have any thoughts on that? Because if you don't, I do.
No, that's a really good question. I think the beauty of the statistical technique that we used here is that we can infer the direction of the relationship. So in that sense, we can see, based on strong theories like the control and value theory of achievement emotions, that instrumental motivation and self-concept will influence maths anxiety, and other models have been used to look at the direction of the influence of maths anxiety on self-regulated processes and eventually mathematical literacy. But it's important, obviously, to bear in mind that when we use PISA data, PISA only offers a snapshot, of a single point in time. And so it cannot really show how a particular student evolves over the course of their studies. And self-regulated learning has been described as a self-oriented feedback loop in which students use a dynamic, cyclical process to monitor their own learning. So obviously here we need to collect longitudinal data to confirm and further investigate the dynamics of the relationships that we identified in our model.
Yeah, and I agree with what you say completely. I would also say that you test your models. They are theoretically based, and so it's not a data fishing exercise. So you are testing relationships that have been found and illustrated to be there previously through previous research. The other thing is that, like all the other international assessments, there are frameworks which already postulate or make assumptions about relationship between the variables. And of course, yes, while each PISA data collection is only one point in time, I think, and that's where I think PISA, the replication, because I'm pretty certain that if you do this analysis again in 9 years when maths is again a major domain, or if you had done it with the 2003 data, then you probably will find similar results. And while that is still no proof of causation, I think that's what this question is aiming at. I think through these, having theory, prior research, and finding something again and again and again is sort of contributing to saying, well, there is probably something there. Okay, now I realize we are nearly out of time. I'm aware that we've got lots and lots of questions. So what we will do here as a team is we will go through the questions and we will answer them afterwards as best as we can. I'm not sure how we can get them out, whether to maybe all the attendees or something, but we will address them either individually or somehow to the whole group, because there's lots of questions there and comments. And ultimately, so I will have to wind it up now. To say thank you very much again to the panelists for your research, to your collaborators, partners in crime, to Kylie for editing the special issue. For all of the attendees, thank you for participating. As I said, we will honor your input and we'll get back to you with responses. Now, some of the things might actually be able to be answered by having a look at the articles. For example, trends over time. A couple of the articles here, John's and also Emma's, talk about that in reading. And then, you know, and those articles are available free of charge to anyone during November. Download them, share them, read them. We'd be very happy. And yeah, and I think it was just a wonderful opportunity and to showcase that PISA data, while maybe being contentious, but they still provide a good resource for doing some more in-depth analysis than the horse race and league tables that we so often hear the day after the results are released. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for attending, and all the best to everyone. Goodbye now.